The rich, earthy scent of Hattie Mae's signature sweet potato pie filled the hallway, but inside the dining room, the air was cold enough to freeze water. Hattie paused for a moment before the gilded mirror in the foyer, smoothing the fabric of her deep plum velvet dress. It was a rich, regal color, though her husband, Richard, had told her just an hour ago that it looked dated. She reached up and touched the single string of pearls at her throat, antique, genuine, and purchased with her own money 30 years ago. They were cool against her warm skin, a silent reminder of a time when she was the one saving him, not the other way around. Taking a breath that steadied her soul, Hattie walked into the dining room of their sprawling Greenwich estate. The room was a masterpiece of intimidation. Crystal chandeliers glittering like suspended ice, silver cutlery aligned with military precision, and white roses that smelled of absolutely nothing. Richard stood by the head of the table, checking his watch impatiently. He was dressed in a sharp Italian suit that cost more than Hattie's father had made in a year. He didn't look up when she entered. "I brought the pie," Hattie said softly, placing the warm, fragrant dish in the center of the long mahogany table. It was her grandmother's recipe, the one thing that made this cold museum of a house feel like a home on Thanksgiving. Richard finally looked at her, his lip curling in a faint, dismissive sneer. "Hattie, really? We have a French pastry chef catering tonight. That rustic thing disrupts the aesthetic." He snapped his fingers at a passing server. "Move this to the sideboard. Put the orchid arrangement here instead." Hattie watched her pie being demoted to a dark corner, but she said nothing. She knew better than to make a scene before the guests arrived. Just then Vanessa walked in. She was 28, blonde, and wearing a white dress that looked more appropriate for a summer gala than a Thanksgiving dinner. She breezed past Hattie without a word, going straight to Richard to adjust his tie. "The board members are pulling into the driveway, Richard. Remember, confident face. We need to show them the new Hamilton logistics." "I'm always confident," Richard replied, smiling at Vanessa in a way he hadn't smiled at Hattie in a decade. When the guests filled the room, a mix of nervous family members and calculating board directors, the seating arrangement revealed the true depth of Richard's cruelty. Traditionally, the wife sat at the host's right hand. But tonight, Richard pulled out that chair for Vanessa. "You sit here, my dear," he said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "We need the new PR strategy front and center." He gestured vaguely toward the far end of the table, near the kitchen swinging door. "Hattie, you'll be more comfortable down there. Less pressure to keep up with the business talk." Hattie walked the length of the table, her head high, ignoring the pitying looks from her son Lucas. She took her seat in exile. As the expensive wine was poured, she folded her hands and cleared her throat, her voice calm but carrying the weight of 60 years of dignity. "Shall we say grace?" she asked. "Lord, we thank you for." "Let's skip the superstitions and get to the wine, shall we?" Richard interrupted, his voice booming over hers. He didn't even glance at her. He raised his glass, cutting off her prayer as if she were a background noise he could simply switch off. The disrespect was so sharp it felt physical, like a slap. But Hattie didn't flinch. She just watched him, her eyes dark and unreadable. Richard taps his silver spoon against his crystal glass. Ding, ding, ding. Silencing the room and signaling that the real show is about to begin. Can you believe the audacity of that spoon tap? Interrupting a prayer to serve wine? If you felt that disrespect deep in your soul and you are rooting for Hattie to take her power back, drop a number 8 in the comments right now to let me know you're watching. And if you love stories where dignity wins and arrogance falls, make sure to subscribe to Black King and hit that notification bell. You do not want to miss the justice that is about to be served in this dining room. Your support helps us keep telling these powerful stories. Now, let's see what happens when the silence finally breaks. The sharp ring of the spoon against the glass faded, but the silence that followed was heavy, suffocating, and thick with a dread that only Hattie seemed to anticipate. Guests shifted in their chairs, their eyes darting between the sparkling crystal glasses and the man standing at the head of the table. Everyone expected a toast to family, or perhaps a boast about the company's stock price. Instead, Richard reached down and produced a thick, yellow manila envelope. It looked aggressive against the pristine white tablecloth, a bureaucratic weapon brought to a sacred family feast. With a casual flick of his wrist, He slid the envelope down the long stretch of polished mahogany. It hissed across the wood, passing the roasted turkey, passing the silver gravy boat, until it stopped precisely in front of Hattie's empty plate. "I think it's time we stop pretending, Hattie," Richard said, his voice terrifyingly calm. He adjusted his cufflinks, looking not at his wife, but at the board members, as if presenting a quarterly report. "This marriage has been over for years. We've been living parallel lives, and frankly, it's exhausting. As we head into the new fiscal year, I need to trim the fat, both in the company and in this house." A collective gasp rippled through the room. Hattie's son, Lucas, started to rise, his face flushing with anger, but Hattie placed a calming hand on his arm, her eyes never leaving her husband. She sat perfectly still, her posture as straight as a steel beam. "I need a partner who fits the future of Hamilton logistics, not its past," Richard continued, gesturing proudly toward Vanessa, who beamed under the spotlight. "Someone who understands the speed of the modern world and projects the right image." Vanessa leaned forward, her smile dripping with a false, poisonous sympathy. "We just want you to be comfortable, Hattie," she purred, tilting her head. "Somewhere quieter. Maybe you should move back down south? You don't really fit in this high-stress corporate world anymore. It's for your own good, really." The insult hung in the air, thick and ugly. It wasn't just about age. It was a dismissal of her entire identity, a suggestion that she belonged in the past, hidden away where she wouldn't embarrass them. Richard drove the point home, his arrogance swelling with every word. "Let's be honest. I built this empire from nothing. You were fine for raising the kids, but you're a liability to the brand now. I need a queen, not a relic." The room seemed to shrink. Everyone waited for the tears, the scream, the shattered glass. But Hattie didn't scream. She slowly picks up the envelope, looks Richard dead in the eye, and asks in a steady, low voice, "Are you absolutely sure about this, Richard?" Most women would have thrown the wine, flipped the table, or burst into tears, but Hattie Mae did the one thing Richard didn't expect. She smiled. It wasn't a smile of joy, nor was it the polite, submissive smile she had worn for decades to smooth over his rough edges at social gatherings. It was a cold, knowing curve of the lips that didn't quite reach her eyes. "You find this funny?" Richard asked, his brow furrowing. He had expected begging. He had prepared himself to be magnanimous in victory, to offer her a generous monthly allowance if she went quietly. But silence? A smile? That wasn't in the script. "Dad, this is insane. You can't do this on Thanksgiving." Lucas shouted, shoving his chair back so hard it screeched against the parquet floor. He stood up, his fists clenched at his sides. "Mom has done everything for this family. Everything for this company." Richard waved a dismissive hand at his son, barely glancing his way. "Sit down, Lucas. You're emotional. You don't understand the complexities of running a billion-dollar enterprise. This is about legacy. I'm doing this for your future just as much as mine." He turned back to Hattie, his voice dripping with condescension. "See? This is why we need to separate. You're confusing the boy. You make everyone think with their hearts instead of their heads." He leaned over the table, his eyes narrowing. "Answer the question, Hattie. Are you sure you want to drag this out? Because let's look at the facts. You have no business degree. You have no connections in the city. Your family's money, that quaint little inheritance you were so proud of, that's ancient history. All you have are your kitchen skills and your dignity. If you fight me, you'll lose even that." Hattie listened to every word, absorbing the venom without flinching. She watched Vanessa check her reflection in a silver spoon, already bored with the drama. She watched the board members shift uncomfortably, avoiding her gaze. And then, slowly, deliberately, she reached down toward her handbag which sat on the floor beside her chair. Richard rolled his eyes and let out a heavy sigh. "Oh God. Here come the tissues. Please, Hattie, don't make a scene." It's pathetic. But Hattie didn't bring up a tissue. Her hand emerged holding a second envelope. It wasn't crisp and white like the one Richard had slid across the table. This one was yellowed with age, slightly dog-eared at the corners, and bore the heavy wax-stamped seal of a notary public from 1999. The sound of it hitting the table was softer than Richard's spoon, but it carried the weight of a gavel. Richard froze. His eyes locked onto the faded legal stamp. He recognized it. Deep in the buried archives of his memory, from a time when he was desperate and broke, he recognized it. She places the old envelope directly on top of his divorce papers and says softly, "I think you've forgotten who actually owns the chair you're sitting in, Richard." That is exactly how you silence a room. If you are still watching and that plot twist just gave you chills, please drop a number 8 in the comments below to let me know you are here standing with Hattie. And if you haven't already, I strongly recommend you subscribe to Black King and turn on that notification bell so you don't miss a single beat of what happens next. Your support is what drives us to keep creating amazing content that informs and inspires you. Now, let's open that envelope and see exactly what Richard forgot. See. The room was so silent you could hear the snow tapping against the window panes as Richard's trembling hand finally pulled the yellowed documents from the envelope. The paper crinkled loudly, the sound like a gunshot in the quiet room. He squinted at the text, trying to make sense of the faded typewriter font through his reading glasses, which suddenly seemed to slide down his sweating nose. "What is this?" he muttered, his voice losing its polished baritone and cracking into something thin and reedy. "These are just the old incorporation papers. From the bankruptcy scare in '99. Why are you showing me this?" "Read Article 4, Richard," Hattie said, her voice cutting through the air like a knife. "The ownership structure." Richard's eyes scanned down the page. He stopped. He blinked, shook his head, and read it again. The blood drained from his face so fast it looked like he might faint. There, in black and white ink that had dried 25 years ago, were the numbers that defined their reality. Shareholder A. Hattie Mae Hamilton, 72% shareholder B. Richard Hamilton, 28%. This is a mistake," Richard stammered, looking around the table for support that wasn't there. "I'm the CEO. I founded this. You just signed the loan papers." "No, Richard," Hattie corrected him, leaning forward slightly. "You had a vision, yes. But you also had $3 million in debt and a reputation so toxic no bank in New York would touch you. Do you remember who bailed you out? It wasn't your country club friends. It was me. It was my grandfather's inheritance. Money he saved sweeping hair in a barbershop for 50 years. Black money, Richard. The same money you now think isn't sophisticated enough for your brand." Vanessa snatched the paper from Richard's limp hand. She scanned it, her eyes widening in horror. "Richard, is this legal? If she owns 72%, that means she controls the board. She controls everything. You were so desperate to sign the bailout check, you didn't even read the terms," Hattie continued, a hint of steel entering her tone. "I made myself the majority owner to protect my family's legacy from your recklessness. I let you play CEO. I let you wear the suits and give the speeches because I wanted you to feel like a man. But I never gave you the crown." Richard slammed his fist on the table, rattling the silverware. "You tricked me. A woman like you can't run a logistics empire. The investors won't stand for it. You don't know the first thing about corporate strategy." "I've been running it from the shadows for 20 years, Richard," Hattie replied calmly. "Who do you think approved the expansion loans? Who vetoed the merger with Tyson Corp? Me. Every major decision you thought you made? I signed off on it while you were sleeping." Richard opened his mouth to argue, to scream, to assert dominance, but he had nothing left. He was a king without a kingdom. Hattie, however, wasn't finished. She reached into her purse again to pull out a third item. "And since we are discussing who is fit for the company, let's talk about the money you stole." Vanessa's confident smile had completely vanished, replaced by the calculating look of a woman realizing she had bet her future on a sinking ship. She slowly pulled her hand away from Richard's shoulder, as if his sudden loss of power was a contagious disease she didn't want to catch. Hattie opened the third folder. It wasn't old and yellowed like the incorporation papers. It was crisp, thick, and filled with spreadsheets highlighted in neon orange. "You wanted a modern face for the company, Richard?" Hattie asked, tapping a manicured nail on the document. "Is that why you spent $400,000 of company funds on a penthouse in Manhattan and first-class tickets to Paris for your consultant here?" Richard's mouth opened and closed like a fish on dry land. Those were business expenses. Networking." "No, Richard," Hattie said, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "I hired a forensic accountant 6 months ago. We tracked every penny. The jewelry, the dinners, the lease on the condo under Vanessa's name. Stealing from a wife is a divorce issue. But stealing from the majority shareholder? That's embezzlement. That's a federal crime, Richard. And I have the board of directors on speed dial. The heir left the room. Vanessa looked from Hattie to Richard, her eyes wide with panic. She did the math instantly. Richard wasn't just losing his company. He was facing prison time. The billionaire lifestyle she had been auditioning for just evaporated. You said you handled the finances. Vanessa hissed at Richard, her voice shrill. You said she was nobody. She is nobody. Richard shouted, desperate. Vanessa, baby, don't listen to her. We can fight this. Vanessa stood up so abruptly her chair tipped over. She grabbed her designer coat, paid for, Hattie noted, with Hamilton Logistics money, and looked at Richard with pure disgust. I don't do prison wives, Richard. And I certainly don't date broke men. She didn't even look at Hattie. She simply turned on her heel and marched out of the dining room, the clicking of her heels fading into the hallway, leaving Richard sitting alone in the wreckage of his own arrogance. Hattie stood up then. She didn't look triumphant. She looked like a judge delivering a sentence she had hoped she'd never have to pass. Effective immediately, you are removed as CEO for gross misconduct and breach of fiduciary duty, she declared, reciting the bylaws she had written herself 25 years ago. Security will escort you out. You can take your car, but leave the company phone and the keys to this house. Richard slumped in his chair, a man hollowed out. He looked up at the woman he had called a relic, the woman he had tried to erase, and saw for the first time the mountain he had foolishly tried to move. Richard, stripped of his title, his mistress, and his pride, looks at Hattie and asks brokenly, "Why did you wait until today?" Winter had turned to early spring, and while the dirty snow melted off the sidewalks of Manhattan, the fortunes of the Hamilton family had shifted as drastically as the seasons. In a cramped studio apartment in Queens, the only place he could afford after the assets were frozen and the IRS audits began, Richard sat on a folding chair, staring at a small television set. He adjusted the rabbit ears, trying to clear the static. He was eating a microwave dinner that tasted like cardboard, a far cry from the roasted turkey he had turned his nose up at just a few months ago. On the screen, a news anchor was beaming. And finally tonight, our turnaround CEO of the year. Hattie Mae Hamilton has defied Wall Street expectations. Since taking full control of Hamilton Logistics, stock prices are up 30%. But it's her new community initiative, Roots and Routes, that has everyone talking. Richard stopped chewing. The camera cut to Hattie. She looked magnificent. She wasn't wearing the stiff gray suits he used to force her to buy. She was wearing a vibrant emerald green blazer, her hair in natural braids, looking regal and commanding. She was standing in the company warehouse, not hiding in a boardroom. She spoke to the reporter with a warmth that Richard realized he had never truly deserved. We built this company on efficiency, Hattie said on screen, but we are rebuilding it on integrity. You can't deliver a package if you don't know where you came from. Richard turned the TV off. The silence in his tiny room was deafening. He looked at his reflection in the dark screen, older, tired, and completely alone. He had chased a younger image and lost the timeless substance that had been right beside him. Meanwhile, in the expansive, sunlit boardroom of Hamilton Logistics, the atmosphere was electric. Hattie sat at the head of the table, the seat Richard used to occupy. But unlike Richard's cold rain, the room was filled with laughter. Lucas walked in, carrying a white box. He set it down in the center of the table, right on top of the quarterly projections. VP of Operations reporting for duty, Lucas grinned. And I brought the fuel. He opened the box. Inside was a fresh, homemade sweet potato pie. The scent of cinnamon, nutmeg, and caramelized sugar filled the corporate air, chasing away the sterile smell of dry erase markers. The board members didn't sneer. They reached for plates. Hattie had made her heritage a core part of the company culture, proving that soul and strategy didn't have to be enemies. Hattie took a slice, looking out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the city skyline that she now officially ruled. She thought about Richard alone in the cold, and Vanessa running from her own reputation. She felt no bitterness, only a deep, settling peace. She had waited 20 years not out of weakness, but out of preparation. She had simply waited until the world was ready to see her, and until she was ready to stop hiding. She took a bite of the pie, savoring the familiar, rich flavor that reminded her of her grandfather's barbershop and her own resilience. She smiled warmly at her son and said, "See? Authentic always tastes better than artificial."